If you are a parent or know a parent struggling to help your kids to best cope with the stresses of COVID-19, then you are going to want to watch this video. So let's think about it for a moment. You're surviving COVID, but maybe you're just surviving. This change in our lifestyle has an effect on all of us, especially our kids. And maybe you've adapted and are doing well, but some are barely getting by. And personally, I'm not immune to the struggle. My teenagers have been dealing with their own traumas along with the trauma of COVID. They, in many ways, struggle to cope, and so do we as parents. So I am really, really excited to have our guest today, Robin Blumenthal. I want to welcome you today. She is the author of Who in the Zoo Are You? A short story for children of all ages and the adults who teach, love, and work with them. So first, before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of an intro. Robin is a parent of 6 daughters and married to her husband, Roger, for 29 years. She was a children's and family pastor for 28 years. She was the education domain director for a group called For Tucson, a Christian nonprofit organization, and is now stepping into full-time training, coaching, speaking, and writing. And after hearing about things like trauma-informed care and the Adverse Childhood Experiences study in May of 2018, it changed her life. And she's committed herself to learning and developing and teaching this life-changing information to the masses. She is going to have an impact on the world. Robin's a trainer, speaker, event organizer. She just finished this book, Where in the Zoo Are You? You're going to hear about that. It's a children's book with resources to help kids talk about their emotions concerning traumatic events like COVID-19. And before we get started, someone today is going to potentially win a copy of this book. So if you want an entry, what I'm going to need for you to do is drop something into the comments, say hi, or better yet, ask a question and we'll answer it. Actually, Robin will answer it because I have no answers these days when it comes to parenting. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Robin.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for asking me, and I am just excited, and hopefully I can give some tools that parents can use.
Oh, that's wonderful. Would you go ahead and just tell us a little bit more about your journey?
Well, for many years, I have a degree in child development and a master's in human resource leadership. So it's not that I had never heard of trauma or that people had had traumatic experiences, but until that May of 2018, I had never understood how those experiences affect the way kids, and as we grow into adults, how we look at life, how we view relationships, whether our brains predict trust or safety, and how all of those things really shape who we are in both good and difficult ways. And so the more that I learned, the more I thought, man, if I had known this information, it would have changed how I parent, it would have changed how I was a pastor, it would have changed how I interact with even friends and people who I might talk to or coach or visit with, or even how I might interact with the clerk at the store when something goes awry and their response is different than I think. It has helped me to view through this trauma-informed lens, to kind of assume that probably most of us have something behind the story of what others see in us that affects how we interact with them.
Oh, yeah. You're so right, and I appreciate that. And I see that we've got some people jumping on, and so thank you for jumping on. And if you have questions, go ahead and stick them in the comments or shoot us something in those comments, because at some point we're going to announce the winner of Robin's new book. So just feel free to toss that, any questions you have in the comments as we go. So tell me about like your path today, and what do you find yourself doing now?
Now, when I have been in either the family pastor or when I worked with For Tucson, I really felt more and more called to do this idea of training people to understand trauma. Now, I don't have a social work degree or something that, upper brain science kind of things, which in some ways is good because it helps me to say, hey, if I can understand how trauma affects the brain enough to know how to better relate to people, how to better communicate, how to keep myself from being triggered as much, then maybe I can help other people. And the interesting thing is when I first started learning about all of the area of trauma, at the same time, we actually entered into the foster care system and got our foster daughter. And I can tell you that daily I will read something or learn something about trauma, and then I will see it act out in my own home about why it's so important. A few months ago, my daughter, who is 16, we adopted her about a year and a half ago, said, "I really help you in your work, don't I?" And I'm like, yes, because I can see it's just like a living example to see. I watch how settled she has become, how having a consistent relationship has made the world of difference for her. And I think how important that is for not only the kids in our foster care system, but the kids in our classrooms, in our homes. It helps me when my coworkers, as I maybe think of someone and I think, I wonder what happened in their past that causes them to react in this way. And I can be curious instead of judgmental or pointing a finger. And I certainly don't do it perfectly, but it's a daily growing experience. And I think that it is valuable. And what a society we would be, right, if we understood the importance of empathy and connection with anybody in our life.
You are right about that. And there's certain things that even just reading this book has opened my eyes to, as far as the way that we've looked at things and things that we've learned along the way. My wife and I, we're foster parents and adopted 4 fantastic kids. And there were a lot of these trauma-related issues that they deal with that for a long time we didn't understand. And so that created a big challenge. And there's still some challenges. And I'm thankful now that we're at least beginning to develop this understanding of what happens during these kinds of traumas that allow us to better parent, even though every day we're still trying to figure it out. So really appreciate you being here. So quick question. What do you think are some of the problems that you're seeing today when it comes to trauma and how we're parenting, or what's happening in the pandemic? What do you think?
Yeah, let's talk about it in terms of the pandemic. And I think one of the things, and in fact, the reason that I ended up writing the book is I was working with a local school district on a social emotional learning committee. And we were talking about the various experiences that kids were having during COVID, and that the leaders, the teachers, and the administrators were having. And so you had such a wide range of experiences from my parents, for example. Their doctor said, if you get COVID, you're probably going to die. So you better not really leave the house unless you have to. You need to be taking all kinds of precautions. And then there were other people in my life who were really saying, if you had enough faith, you wouldn't have this fear and you wouldn't need to wear a mask. And you had those like on the two ends of that huge extreme. So you think of kiddos who had been home in, a small apartment where there was months where you couldn't really go outside. Not only the weather, but the playground at the apartment was closed or the pool was closed. And then you have other kids who, parents had a nice big house with a backyard and full access to Wi-Fi and computers. And all of those varying degrees really are important for us to go forward with empathy, because I think especially as the world begins to open back up, if I were to say to you, Dr. Tompkins, you've been vaccinated and it's totally fine. You don't have to wear a mask. You're fine. Feel safe. My telling you that and you feeling safe are not really the same thing. And if I make you feel shame or judged that you don't have enough faith or confidence in the vaccine, any of those things. And I'm not even saying we should or should not agree in the confidence in the vaccine. What I'm saying is that it's all about how we perceive that trust and that safety. And so when I can relate to you, whether you are living out of fear or anxiety or anger, if I can communicate empathy and support of you, we're going to go a long way towards helping our community heal. If I sit there and point fingers or roll my eyes or say, well, I don't understand what your problem is, or I don't know why you're waiting in line or why you aren't going to wait in line. Like either way, I think we just have to approach each other with that empathy and understanding. And that happens whether it's in our house or if it's in our school, our classroom, or in the community at large.
Wow, that's really powerful. It's amazing how we can all go through the same situation and have either a different experience or just a different reaction to that same experience, and how easy it is to expect others to have the same response, or the same, or
Right, because trauma, exactly. It's about how we perceive what happened to us, not just what happened to us. And that's where that judgment can come in. Like if I say, I went through the same thing, I went through the pandemic, Dr. Tompkins, and I'm not worried. Or if you say to me, well, you should be worried. Do you see where I'm saying? I think you're totally right. It's about understanding that each of us, it's that perception that we have in our own life.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. And guys, if you like this info, feel free to just shoot us a like at the bottom of the video, and maybe leave a comment. Definitely leave a comment, because if you have questions, we want to be able to answer your questions. And we've got a question here that we're going to answer. And also for the people that are here that are putting things in the comments, and as we go through the day, you're even able to do this during the replay. I'm going to, at the end of the day, announce the winner of the book. And that's going to be someone who has left a comment down in the comment section. So I think let's go ahead and let's go right into some questions, and then I'll keep going here. Actually, yeah. So we'll go right to this question. We have. Let's see here if I can drag it onto our page here. All right. It says, how can I make sure both parents are on the same page when things get hard at home?
That's a great question. And here's really, I guess the bottom line is, you really can't. But in so doing that, if you were to help kids or help each other understand that each of you have a valid page, I think that's really the key. It's kind of like how many parents are co-parenting in different homes. And I have parents all the time will say, well, their dad lets them do this. And then the mother will say, well, I don't really like that. I don't think that's okay or appropriate. And I think that the thing that we have to remember is each of us can only do what we feel called to do. But I think open communication can go a long way in understanding why the other parent is not on that page. If we're curious about that behavior, let's say my husband and I might not agree with the age our daughter should date, or we might not agree if whether homework should be done right when you get home, or if there can be a break and maybe later, or about snacks or anything really. If we ask and are curious about why the other believes that. Tell me more about why you're worried about dating, or tell me more about why you think homework has to be done right when we get home, and really try to see what's the need driving the behavior of that parent in terms of their opinion. Then I think you might come more, you may not get on the exact same page, but you might get a lot closer and realize that, okay, there is some validity to that, and you might be able to come to some agreement. So hopefully that can offer you. But I think no matter what, when we are curious about the behavior of the people around us, from the store clerk to our spouse to our 5-year-old, it really can help when we really just stop and are curious about that behavior and what is that need that drives the behavior. All behavior has a need.
That's fantastic. I wonder, it almost sounds like we should address that in the similar way that we should address parenting, realizing that we're coming from a different place for a reason, and trying to understand that reason. So I really appreciate that. All right. Now, so I have another question here, or a comment that came up. Says, my opinion, tolerance does not equal empathy. How can you explain how that looks?
I think that's a great point. I think sometimes I might tolerate a person or a behavior or a situation, but not really look into trying to feel that person's perspective. And I think empathy is all about feeling the perspective of another, or being able to understand the perspective. Brene Brown does a lot of amazing work on empathy. And in a class I was teaching last night, we watched a video. You can just find it in YouTube, Brene Brown on empathy. And she talks about how sometimes we try to silver line another person's feelings. I'm just as bad at that as the next person. Instead of just saying, I really want to try to take your perspective. Why does this seem difficult to you, or why is this difficult to you? And I think there was a person on a call I was with yesterday who had really been affected during all of the racial tension. And her mother during that time had surgery, and of course they couldn't go in the hospital. And I never had thought about this. She said, here they are, this person of color was in the hospital, and they had to rely on everybody else to demonstrate love to their parent. Because of COVID, they couldn't go in. And she talked about how she broke down a little. She said how hard that was. And I thought, I never would have thought of that. That's not a perspective that I have, but I could see how that might be really difficult in my little bit of ways, trying to get closer to that perspective. So I think that's really important, is that empathy is the ability for us to try to walk in that other person's shoes and give us a lens into how they view the world, rather than stand there and say, well, I don't know why you don't trust, or why do you have those questions, or why are you not afraid? And the same is true even when we're parenting our kids, that when we have that empathy, it really changes things, and it changes our relationship for the better. And honestly, parenting, I think that most of us would probably agree. When my kids get to be 18, I want to keep having a good relationship with them. I don't want to go, whew, I'm done, and they're off, and maybe I'll see you once a year at Christmas. I want to have a relationship, and what happens up to age 18 really can affect that relationship.
Yeah, you're right about that. What do you think are some of the typical mistakes that we make as parents?
I think one of the things, if we want to keep our focus around empathy today, and there's a lot of other things we could talk about, but I think a lot of times with kids is that I know what I want for my kids, right? I want them to have the very best life. I want them to work hard and to be responsible, and I want them to capture every opportunity. But my wanting them to do that and their desire to do that aren't always the same. So we end up in power struggles sometimes with our kiddos when we try to say, like, you have so much more potential. Well, maybe they do. But frankly, I know a lot of adults that I think have a lot more potential than maybe what they're living out. And I can't, force them into doing that. We can encourage them and we can coach them. But when we walk alongside our kids with empathy over their hard choices, then I think sometimes we say, man, that is really hard. How did that feel when you went to the principal's office? Versus when I say, I can't believe you went to the principal's office. I might feel embarrassed or angry as a parent, but I wasn't there in the class. I couldn't change my child's behavior. But if I can say, that must have felt hard to be in the principal's office. Now, I will say that many kids will respond like, oh, I didn't even care. And then really what that is their way of trying to keep control. And so if we can give them that control, well, I'm glad that it didn't bother you. Some kids might have been embarrassed, but I guess you're not one of them. And let them sit in that and think about that. Because the bottom line is, if I'm going to try to make my child feel bad, it's going to still hurt our relationship. And I can't make them feel any different way, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. I think in an attempt to make your kids feel bad, it really just creates more of a disconnect in that that relationship. It just makes our relationship worse and worse. Great. So tell me more about the book.
So the book, when I put it together, thinking of all the different experiences that people were having during the pandemic, it's been said, right, that we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And as I saw how little empathy during the window, it was probably about midsummer, I thought I was in a training actually where they talked about sometimes when we can all start from a similar starting point. And I thought, gosh, I should make this book. I was kind of trying to toss around some ideas into a fable or a story, really. So it's a story of a zoo that experiences a flood, and the animals are all affected differently. So the flood affected the whole zoo, in fact, the whole city. But in the Living World Zoo, the zookeepers weren't able to get in for about 10 days because of the danger. Thinking a lot to how many of us haven't been able to check on people with how they're really doing, right? Because I can't travel to California to see my mom without the fear of possibly bringing COVID to her. And teachers connecting with their students in different ways than they ever thought they would have to do before. So each animal has a different experience. Some of the animals, Millie and Milton, the giraffes, are up to their necks in water, and they're thinking that any minute the water is going to cover their heads. And then there's like Max the tiger, who is angry because his world has been disrupted and he doesn't really understand why. All he knows is that his dinner has not been showing up every day at 5 o'clock. And even the gorillas, and I have to be honest, the Jade and Momo, the two gorillas, get out of their exhibit and they're kind of making fun of everybody because they had a great time. They were able to get out. And honestly, when the pandemic first started, that's really where I was. I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're shutting down everything. This is just the flu. In a couple weeks, it'll all be fine. And clearly, I was wrong on that, right? Clearly, as I looked and I saw the real fear that people had, even if that fear, let's say years later, they say, oh, it really wasn't a fear or whatever. I mean, I don't know how that would happen, but let's say it did. It was still a fear in these individuals' lives, in their eyes, in their thoughts. Their brain was still reacting in that fearful mode. So whether there's a real fear or not, it's still real to the person. And when we can respond with that empathy. So basically writing the story was a chance for kids to maybe talk about, or adults. I've had a lot of adults say it was really helpful for them. Which animal in the zoo do you feel like? Or which ones can you relate to? And which ones are easier for you to help and which ones would be harder? And what does it look like to help? How does it look like to be patient with someone? Even if we think about it, my daughter's school, she'll be going back one day a week, right? That's their hybrid coming up after the spring break. And at first she was excited, then she got nervous, then she said, I don't want to go. And then now she's trying to think, gosh, the students that are going to be there, they're not necessarily the ones she was close friends to. What is that going to look like? And part of me as a parent, my role has to be to understand all of those different feelings and still support her, that it's important for you to take that first step back. Right. But sometimes it's hard because sometimes I think you've been begging to go back. Why are you now dragging your feet? But because the desire to be out there is there. But then there's that fear. In her case, it's not about COVID, but it's about the relationships. But for many of us, it might be about the fear of, is it still prevalent? Might I still catch it, even though I had the vaccine, even though the restaurants are open? Do I feel safe to do that? And that felt safety is really important. So all of that is kind of interwoven through this story.
I was thinking as we were kind of dialoguing through this, I'm just imagining this. You have this crisis, this thing that happens, this particular trauma. We have lots of different kinds of responses that just kind of feed off of that, different ways that we potentially can respond. And so then on top of that, and then all those responses happen. And because it's traumatic, there's a very wide range of different responses. And as a parent, it just, for me, I don't know, it hit me for some reason. I have a way that I respond to things, and in my mind, we survive and we seem to do pretty well. So if we all just respond that way, wouldn't life be good, kids? Wouldn't that be great if you just did things this way? But my kids and I are not the same person, and I think that's probably the case with most families. And so their response are not the same as my response. And then I think if we only did this one response, life would be good. And that is so completely unrealistic for me to expect from anyone different in general. But then when we're talking about kids that are going through trauma, it's a recipe for disaster and a recipe for troubled relationships. And so it's just and I think we can apply this to so many things. Empathy can be applied to so many different aspects of our lives. What do you think of that?
I totally agree. And here's the other thing, that sometimes we assume that our response to trauma or the way we react is within our control. And that's an assumption that often isn't the case, right? Our
Hmm.
brain is designed for when we feel threatened, then our brain kicks into that fight, flight, or freeze. And sometimes we have no control over that. I talk to a lot of parents and they're like, well, what do I do when I just immediately my default is yelling or lecturing or whatever it might be? We most of the time in the middle of that, we can't stop it. But we can look back the next day or the next hour and say, gosh, that response isn't the kind of response I want to have. And we can start to try to learn different responses. So the neural pathways in our brain, right? If you've ever seen the ruts of the Oregon Trail, this is a great visual for me because they're like 4 feet deep, made out of rock. And when the settlers were coming on the Oregon Trail, right, they would just keep following that same path, and it got very deep. So if you were to take your car, if you could, and go in there, you wouldn't just go, I'm going to make a quick turn out of this. Like you're kind of stuck there for a while. But if you were to continue to try to make turns over the course of time, you would make a new pathway, and our brains can kind of do that. So one of the things is to be curious about our own responses to trauma. And I mean trauma in terms of it could be COVID, it could be the election, it could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traumatic event that happened to us as a child. But when we learn to go, my default is usually X. I hunker down or I yell or I do whatever. But maybe I could start doing things. I was just in a training right before this podcast that where we talked about learning to just breathe deep for a few minutes. When you take 3 or 4 deep cleansing breaths, that actually can help lower your heart rate and slow your breathing, lower your blood pressure, and get you a little bit back so that you're thinking more out of this part of your brain rather than the back part of your brain where that fight, flight, or freeze is kind of more located, where it goes out. And I think about how many times I will even think, oh, I should take a few deep breaths. No, I'm in control. I'm in control. I can do this. But the reality is I'm not. And there's not really shame in that. Our bodies are designed to help us survive. But when we begin to know better, then we can do better. Maya Angelou says, I did what I knew. And when I knew better, I did better. And I think you're right, Dr. Tompkins. If our kids would all respond the way we think is best, life would be great. But the reality is then we would just have a bunch of little robots, and we don't want that either. So how do we give them a chance to respond how their bent is, but also help them learn some different tools and some different resources in a time when we're all being really calm? And a lot of times for parenting, in the middle of the tantrum in the grocery store or the bedtime argument or getting out the door, for me, sometimes I would default to, this is a great teachable moment. Well, my child's not ready to learn because they're not thinking right here. They're in this, what they perceive as a threat, that they don't get what they want, right? In terms of the simplistic part of it. Or kids that have been through a lot of trauma, that really is a perceived threat. And so we have to be very careful. I know with our daughter, if I would, kind of just poke her or in jest or whatever, even just kind of playing, there was always an immediate, like, visceral reaction. And for me, that was hard because I'm like, I don't pose a threat. But my saying that I'm safe and don't pose a threat isn't the same thing as her perceiving that. And she has many years where that was a threat. So we have to take a long time to help that rebuild to say, this isn't always a threat. And the brain can learn those things, but it's not as simple as us just saying, to our kids, oh, everybody, this will be fine, or whatever it might, that we might want to say and wish we could believe.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one thing to tell us something, but it's another to really understand what they're going through and let them feel and deal with the things that they're dealing with in the way that they do it, while helping them to be healthy in the process. It's great to see the people who are on and watching. And if you have questions, I encourage you right now to pop those questions into the comments, because we're answering questions and we're going to be wrapping it up pretty soon. But also for those that put, you can send us anything in the comments. If you have something in the comments, you're going to be entered to win a copy of the book. Hey, Robin, can you show us your book?
I can. I happen to have a copy.
Oh, that's great.
So
Awesome.
Where in the zoo are you? And it has a feelings word chart in the back, and it has some questions. And really the biggest thing is the conversation. And I think that's very healing, no matter what's going on, because all the studies show that if you have a relationship, that's the start of healing. And when we have a conversation, it helps to make us have a stronger relationship, right? When we can actually lean in and listen. What are you really feeling? And if I can really try to take that perspective, then we have that connection. And we have to connect before we correct. We have to have that relationship that starts from being an active listener and being present for someone. I am here for you. I may not be experiencing what you're experiencing. I may not agree that you should have more cookies instead of dinner, but I can understand how you might want that, and be able to communicate that empathy while at the same time saying, we're not having any more cookies.
So if someone wants to get a copy of your book or to learn more, where do we need to go to get more info?
The best place and the cheapest place really is to go to robinblumenthal.org. You can get it on Amazon, but it's a little pricier there, but you can get it there. And there's also, I have it in packs of 30, so that will bring the cost even down to $5 a piece if a classroom or an organization wanted to purchase it. But robinblumenthal.org, and that gives you an opportunity to there's also some blogs and other tools that might be helpful for you on there, some coloring pages, additional questions or lesson plan ideas. And there's even a sheet on there that talks about Bible verses for families where faith is something that they want to lean into, that talk about verses that have to do with helping with fear and anxiety, so that you have more tools at your fingertips.
Wow, that's fantastic. So I'm going to make sure that I have a link in the comments for robinblumenthal.org. So you're going to want to check that out and get as much information as you can. This whole parenting thing before the pandemic was a challenge. We add all this into it and it becomes even more so. And being able to build that relationship with our kids, to be able to understand what they're going through, is going to help us to better care for them as they're growing up, so that as we get through COVID, we get through COVID in a healthy way, instead of an unhealthy way. Robin, I sure appreciate you. This was fantastic. If you guys want to get a copy of the book, go to robinblumenthal.org. The link will be in the comments here shortly. If you are catching this on the replay and it's still today, Thursday, March 11th, and you have something in the comments, you're going to get entered in to win the free book. And it's really fantastic. I also have one right here. So, Robin, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to leave us with before we go?
I would love to share one quick tool during all of this. If you think about, everybody wants control, right? And that's one of the things that I think all of us are missing, is that we don't get to control where we go and who we see and some of those things. So one of the things that I would encourage you with your kids that can help them is to share as much control as you can. I have some of the different masks, right? You know, one of the ways that we do that is that we let people maybe choose. Here's your type of mask. Yeah, I know it seems small, but being able to choose, even though you can't maybe choose whether or not to wear a mask, but you can choose the design or you can choose the type. And for parents dealing with your kids or kids in a classroom, either way, giving them control over the small things helps them to feel empowered. And that helps us to feel a little more secure, like we have some kind of say in our life. Whether I'm going to drink my juice out of the red cup or the blue cup, or sleep with my door open or closed, or do my homework at this desk or that desk, those little choices go a long way in helping kids to feel like they have some control in a world that feels really out of control. So I just want to encourage you to try using choices, and saying them with empathy will be even better.
That is fantastic. All right. Well, Robin, thank you so much. I sure appreciate you being on today. And guys, for any of you who are watching, she's got some powerful information. I have been a part of workshops and classes that Robin has taught. Really powerful info. She knows her stuff. Check out her book. It could really make a difference. All right. Robin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody listening in.
All right. Have a good day, guys.